Hi, Ginette.
Hi. Dean Smith. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
All right, Dean Smith, I'm going to go off camera so you can start, and I'm sure we'll have some more people join us in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really thrilled. This is like a full circle moment, I just have to say. Our guest Ginette Azco this afternoon, we're very thankful to have her here. I love stories like this. So Ginette reconnected after a number of years, and I had Ginette in class my very first semester at Seton Hall. In our undergraduate program, and she has gone off to do amazing things that Shweta will tell you about in a few minutes. But in reconnecting to Ginette, I learned that she's one of the key people involved in preparing a global report that I'm sure she'll tell you about, that comes out annually on the status of implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, that I've actually assigned as a reading in my class, my summer class, for several years. So I just think that's wonderful that a student who I had in class before the UN program was even conceived, and it's been going on for 23 years now. Well, this will be number 23 this summer. And she is one of the ones authoring the report that we use as one of the benchmarks for how to assess how the global community is doing on the SDGs. So I think it's a wonderful full circle moment. Thank you so much for Ginette for reconnecting and joining us today. And for a more formal and proper introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Shweta to do the honors. But thank you, everyone, and I really look forward to hearing from you this afternoon, Ginette. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Smith. Thank you everyone for being here today. Just to give a little bit of a formal introduction, Ginette Azco is currently a policy specialist at UN Women, the United Nations entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women. She leads the data and statistics team, where she's responsible for producing Progress of the World's Women, UN Women's flagship report, and previously Ginette worked with the United Nations Development Program and the World Bank. Ginette earned her bachelor's degree in international relations from Seton Hall University, a master's degree in international development from the School of Advanced International Studies, and a second master's in public administration from Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Ginette, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. I am beyond excited to be here with you all. Very happy to be reconnecting with my SHU community. So this is really a delight for me as well, and really just happy to be here and happy to share some of the findings from our work here at UN Women. And I hope it adds value to what you're learning and what you're working on at Seton Hall in your various kind of programs and academic pursuits. The material that I will cover today goes beyond SDG 5. The title is a reality check. Are we on track on SDG 5 by 2030? But from our perspective here at UN Women, gender equality is not only essential for delivering the promises on SDG 5, but also foundational for progress across all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Thus, I am going to touch on SDG 5, but I also would like to share with you our latest vis-a-vis, where we are in SDG 1, ending poverty. SDG 2, which is focused, of course, on eliminating hunger, and a few others. I won't touch on all 17. I'm going to do so from the perspective of one, what has been the impact of COVID-19? So for the goals that I am going to be looking at, I wanted to bring in, a view of what COVID-19 has what impact it's had on progress on those goals. And I also want to touch, of course, on the impact on women and girls specifically, since that is the focus of today's discussion. So hopefully you can see my next slide. And here under goal 1, again, the story, unfortunately, is one of reversals. And so that's what I was alluding to with my short introduction, right? What has been the impact of COVID-19 on some of these important global goals? And unfortunately, it has been a story of kind of setbacks and reversals. Extreme poverty globally is again on the rise. The total number of women and girls living on less than $1.90 a day is estimated to be 388 million in 2022. That is an increase from 2020, from 2019. And again, this is really a story of reversals because in fact, we actually were seeing a decline in extreme poverty over the last 10, 15 years. And so really, again, kind of highlighting the real and substantive impact that the pandemic has had on poverty and again on women's vulnerability to poverty. The outlook, unfortunately, could be far worse. We've actually done some forecasting and other analysis to look at other different scenarios. What happens if the situation actually is worse than we believe it to be, where inequality around the world is rising, and where policies that are needed to support the most vulnerable in society are not being taken up. And in fact, actually, with that kind of high damage scenario, the number that I mentioned, right, that 388, could balloon to 446 million women and girls living on really what is a very, very low threshold of $1.90 a day. The number for men, if you're interested, is 427 million under that scenario. This slide was put together for some discussions we've been having with policymakers and with member states. And so you'll see here that I also highlight what needs to happen, right? That we can change this outlook and really what is required is a comprehensive package of policies that support access to education, that supports increased investment in family planning, that supports addressing kind of long enduring inequalities like the pay gap between men and women. And of course, that includes greater support for families living in the poorest households through social protection and social transfers. If we're able to do that, we actually believe with this kind of scenario analysis that over 150 million women and girls could emerge from poverty by 2030. So again, a story of really the need for taking action and taking action now to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. We go to the next slide. This is really kind of, again, focusing on another goal, goal 2. And here we see a similarly worsening situation in the area of food security. An estimated 811 million people went hungry in 2020. And that's an increase of 161 million over 2019, right? So those are really quite massive numbers. Women report facing more food insecurity than men, even when they have the same income and education level, right? So when we control for other variables, we find actually that these inequalities still hold. Here again, in terms of what we've been saying to our country counterparts, is that this trend can be reversed, including by supporting women small-scale producers who typically earn far less than men, and supporting them in a number of ways, right? Through increased funding, through increased kind of training programs, and the reforming of land rights, right? Oftentimes women actually have less access to land than men in their countries. And so another example of how we're taking the data and statistics that governments and others put together to bring visibility to the kinds of policies that we need to see implemented so that women and girls are not left behind in our pursuit to achieve, here, goal 1 and goal 2. In this next slide, I wanted to jump quickly to goal 8. Again, I won't cover all of the goals, but this is another area that we've monitored closely in terms of its impact on women and girls and the impact of COVID-19 on specifically women's employment and economic opportunities. This, of course, is linked to the other 2 goals, right, on poverty and hunger. And what we see, and we've done this in collaboration with our colleagues at ILO, at the International Labor Organization, what we see is that women actually are facing real significant kind of job losses and income loss as a result of the economic fallout of the crisis. Their kind of, economic prospects have been significantly impacted by kind of the indirect impacts of the pandemic. In 2020, the number of employed women declined by 54 million, and 45 million women, many of whom working mothers, left the labor force altogether. And this, of course, has to do with other inequalities in society, right? The inequality within the home in terms of who's caring for children, who's doing kind of the unpaid care and domestic work, and how those inequalities transfer and affect inequalities outside the home. And so I wanted to show you one more slide related to this. This is, again, another look at this issue. On the left side, right, so I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this chart is work that we've been doing actually for a number of years with ILO, really trying to engender the data that we have on employment outcomes, on labor force participation. I mean, from our perspective, it was really important to disaggregate the data, not only by sex, and by sex and age, but to look at it also by household composition, right? So here you can see all households. And so this is the labor force participation of women irrespective of their kind of household or family type. And this is the participation of men in the labor force globally. And so huge gaps, right? 62% of women are engaged in the labor force compared to 93.5% for men. When you disaggregate the data by household composition, and here we focused on women living in coupled households, right, either married or cohabitating with a partner who also have small children, right? So what is the impact of having that caring responsibility on men and on women? And here you can see that the gap is actually larger, right? So less women working in the labor force, more men actually working in the labor force, right? So kind of a nice indication actually of a very sticky problem, which is these kind of social norms that prescribe kind of the caring and the unpaid work to women, and kind of the kind of, the working, the paid work role to men. And this is pre-COVID, right? This is the 2019 estimates. What we actually find is that COVID has had an impact on these figures. So on the right-hand side, this is another figure that we put together with our colleagues from ILO, and it just shows you the trends, right? So you can see that women's participation in the labor force, and here I'm talking about those with working moms with small children at home, has been low, particularly when compared with the 90+% for men, but was on a steady, and unfortunately slow, but steady increase upward. The pandemic, right? So the 2019 and 2020 average, you can see really affected that progress. And we've seen really what is a very sharp decline in the labor force participation of working mothers. According to our latest estimates, over 100 million women between the ages of 25 to 54, so that kind of prime working age, with small children at home are out of the workforce globally. The equivalent number for men for their male counterparts is around 13 million. So giving you really a concrete example there of the inequality. Oh, sorry. Just lost. I don't know if you all can still see my screen, but I lost my view.
We can still see your
You
screen.
can still see it.
Okay, perfect. So let's see if I just, yeah, okay. Great. So anyway, so yeah, just a very good example here with concrete data. And you're going to hear, from my perspective at least, a focus on gender data. That is the work that I do at UN Women, is bringing all of this important data to policymakers to inform policy discourse. But, you know, the value of this data to bring visibility to some of these inequalities and how they're increasing as a result of the pandemic. So yeah, so sorry, let me move this again. I'm trying to move something here and it's, yeah, there we go. I think it's just on my side, which is good. In this next slide, looking at goal 3, and here, you know, is a disruption in the provision of essential health services as a result of the pandemic, including women's access to family planning services. And so we've seen this in past crises, health crises, and we've seen this now with COVID-19 as well, that other priorities take precedent. And what ends up happening is that some of these essential services that oftentimes are critical for women are deprioritized. And so unfortunately, our colleagues at UNFPA have noted significant disruptions in essential services, including women's access to family planning as a result of the pandemic. Of course, this has an impact on some of these very important kind of indicators of progress on good health and well-being that we care about. For example, maternal mortality, but also impacts on the number of women globally who are having unintended pregnancies. And so in the first year of the pandemic, there was an estimated 1.4 million additional unintended pregnancies in lower and middle income countries. And again, very much linked to kind of disruption in essential services. Cross-country data from UN Women. So we've also been looking at other kind of health impacts. So for example, the impact on mental and emotional stress. We did a survey that was conducted in 45 countries, and we found that up to 71% of young women aged 18 to 24, so maybe around the age of many of you who are on the call today, they unfortunately said that they experienced very severe kind of and heightened emotional and mental stress during this time of the pandemic. And actually, this is higher than what we saw for men. So 59% of young men said that they experienced mental and emotional stress. We're also closely monitoring the inequality in access to COVID-19 vaccines. In most countries, men and women have equal access to the vaccines, but in some countries, women are much less likely to have access to the vaccine or to information about the vaccine. And so just giving you a flavor of the different types of health impact, right? So there's the direct impact of the pandemic in terms of exposure to the virus, et cetera, but there's also, of course, indirect impact, and oftentimes these are gendered. At the height of the pandemic, many countries opted for distance learning. The schools were closed, of course. But we also have been monitoring and are quite concerned that even these kind of, options were very limited and not often available to those in the poorest communities. Oftentimes they didn't have access to the internet or to equipment, computers, etc., to access the schooling that they needed through these kind of alternative options. In some countries, for example, they were actually using television and radio to allow students to continue their learning, and even that was limited among the poorest, right? We also know that oftentimes it's the girls that are most impacted by these inequalities within the home. We, of course, have been highlighting again with our country counterparts that we need to be prioritizing the education of women and girls, right? So this is an area actually that over the years we've seen significant increases, significant improvement in girls' education. But again, here as well, unfortunately, a setback as a result of the pandemic. We also know from past health crises that school closures increase the risk of violence, of exploitation, and early marriage for women and girls. So really keeping an eye on this and really advocating for policies that take this into account, right? That are prioritizing the return of girls to school. And unfortunately, not enough countries are doing that, right? So here on the screen, you can see that less than half of countries reported that they were kind of identifying gender sensitive policy responses that were specifically targeted to support girls returning to schools. Unfortunately, because I am, the time is very short today, I'm not going to spend a lot of time highlighting the data that we have disaggregated by other characteristics like race, ethnicity, migration status, refugee status, etc. But that is very much a core component of our work. So, you need to look at all of these issues, not only by sex, but also by the intersection of sex with age, with race, ethnicity, with migration status, disability status, et cetera, right? Oftentimes those that are experiencing these different kind of compounding inequalities are the furthest behind, and we need to make sure that we don't leave them behind. We don't leave them behind in terms of the data that we produce and in terms of the policies that we put together to respond to some of these issues. And so I do encourage you to look at some of our work that highlights some of these issues, even if I don't get a chance to go into any of that detail in this presentation today. This is one of our social media assets where we do highlight the particular vulnerability of refugee girls. And so that's why I wanted to highlight this. But for all of these different areas, where we can try to emphasize the need to look at these issues from that intersectional lens. Under Goal 5, we have a target, which is 5.2 on ending violence against women and girls in all its forms. Where data are available on this issue, and unfortunately, oftentimes the data isn't available, they are pointing to an increase in violence as a result of the pandemic. Women's kind of exposure to violence is spiraling upwards based on the data that we do have. This slide presents findings from data that we collected last year in 13 countries. And here, as you can see, nearly 1 in 2 women reported experiencing or knowing of a woman who experienced a form of violence since COVID-19. So really huge numbers here. And again, highlighting the different and varied ways that women are facing kind of increased challenges during this time of crisis, in terms of the health crisis, but also the economic and the social crisis, right? As you can see, it's been really a crisis that goes beyond kind of the health effects. So given this context, are we on track to achieve gender equality? So now really honing in on Goal 5. The answer, unfortunately, and I think you can see from what I've presented thus far, is that it's no, right? The likely answer and the answer, in fact, is that we're not on track to achieve SDG 5 by 2030. according to the latest data, as you would have seen, right, women have been unduly kind of affected by the socioeconomic fallout of the pandemic. They're disproportionately impacted by high job and livelihood losses, by education disruptions, by the increased burden of unpaid care work at home. And we've also seen significant impacts on their health and access to health services. And of course, all of this is having an impact on their well-being, but of course on us being able collectively to achieve the goals and to achieve SDG 5 by 2030. In an effort to raise awareness on these challenges, UN Women collaborated with the UN Statistical Division and commissioned a new set of data visualizations on the status of SDG 5. This goal is actually under review this year. So governments are going to be looking very closely at where we are in SDG 5 and hopefully coming up with very concrete recommendations for addressing the ongoing challenges and looking for innovative ways to accelerate progress. And so this is really quite timely, and we're looking for ways to really motivate people to look at these issues in detail. And so, as I said, one of the projects that we have at present is looking for ways to visualize the data in new and dynamic ways, right? And so I wanted to take a few minutes today to go over some of these graphics and the results they reveal. So let me turn to the next slide. Just a kind of reminder, SDG 5 is measured using 9 targets and 18 kind of indicators and sub-indicators. The data for this, right, so the global data on all of these indicators and all of these targets are actually being used to populate this visual that you have in front of you. We've taken all of this data, thousands of data points, and assessed them and evaluated kind of the current progress on these various targets and indicators. Each oval, so each little kind of bubble here, represents an SDG 5 indicator. And it's color-coded based on their value for a given country. Blue means that the target is met or almost met, right? So the blue over here. Green is close to target. And it's like a heat map, right? So the warmer the colors get, the worse off we are, with red representing very far from target. So red, orange, and yellow, really indicating that we're not where we need to be. And as you can see from this visual, we have too few blues and greens and too many of those kind of yellow, oranges, and reds, right? The global picture tells us that the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. So if you were to kind of calculate, you know, what percentage is red, et cetera, you would find that globally, 13% of the metrics we use to assess progress on SDG 5 are very far from the 2030 target. 15% are far from target. So that means that over a quarter are currently assessed as being far or very far from target. And of course, there's only 8 years left, right, to achieve SDG 5. And the story, I guess, is really quite a bleak one, right? The distance to equal is long and the time is short. And so, again, really, it's a call for action. In 2 critical areas to women's empowerment, time spent on unpaid care and domestic work, that's target 5.4 here. The world is again kind of far from the target that it set out by 2030. Only 3% of data available for this particular target points to a situation where countries are close to target. In no case does the data assess a country being at target, met, or almost met, right? So when we look at all countries, rich and poor, in terms of, you know, the division of caring responsibilities, right? Is it being kind of divided equally between men and women and between you know, different stakeholders, because of course, I think, you know, society has a role to play to support this very important activity. We're finding that we're not where we need to be. And of course, this is a critical area for SDG 5. In other areas, for example, eliminating discriminatory laws and ending harmful practices, and that's target 5.1 and 5.3. We're at moderate levels. So we have seen some progress in this area, but of course it's deeply insufficient if we're to achieve the SDGs by 2030. There's actually only 8 years left, and so there's a long way ahead of us before we can say that we're where we need to be and on track. Apart from the unevenness of progress, the other striking picture from this visual is the amount of missing data. So all of this gray that you see here, that's actually the information that we don't have, the information that we are lacking for countries around the world. And so what this visual is actually telling you is that we actually have a lot of missing information in some critical areas for women's well-being and women's rights. Gender data has improved over time, but remains very inadequate. Only 48% of data needed to monitor SDG 5 are currently available. And this matters, right? So I started with that visual that showed you the beautiful colors, even if they tell a not so beautiful story. But now when you see it combined with the missing data, you see how much we don't know. And of course, this really matters, right? The absence of statistics reflecting the lives of women and girls renders many of their inequalities and their challenges invisible. So we do need to do better here. Data are essential for raising awareness and ultimately for improving lives, right? For improving the lives of women and girls everywhere. And so as part of our advocacy and the work that we do, our research work, we highlight what we know, but we also take time to highlight what we don't know and call for more data collection to make sure that all women and girls are visible globally, and so that we can really target our policies to affect and improve their lives. The country level picture, perhaps not surprisingly, and hopefully you can see this clearly, but it shows a lot of variability in the current status of progress on SDG 5, but also a lot of variability in the data that's available to track progress. And as I pointed out earlier, the lack of data is a good indication that we aren't paying enough attention to women and girls and their needs, right? So, policies that are targeted at women and girls and targeted at improving and addressing some of their challenges need to be informed by the evidence base. And so where the evidence base is lacking, we're also going to see that those policies are not prioritized. And so it's really, really important to highlight these gaps and to call for the addressing of that in kind of our at the government, at the country level, the policies and priorities in terms of what gets collected, what issues get captured with our kind of censuses and labor force surveys, et cetera, and making sure that that data is kind of processed and reprocessed to capture and to bring visibility to the inequalities that I've highlighted throughout the presentation. Globally, 1 in every 15 countries is very far from target or far from target in at least a third of the SDG 5 indicators. So as you can see from this visual, no country or region comes out looking great. What I also wanted to highlight, and maybe something that's come out in some of your class discussions, is that the SDGs, unlike the MDGs, are really about solidarity, right? Are really about us collectively succeeding on these important global goals, right? So when one country fails, we all fail. And it's really about monitoring progress across all countries and making sure that we're advancing everywhere. And so praising and highlighting countries that are doing great, but also really focusing on those that need extra support and help, and looking for innovative solutions that can address some of the challenges that persist. And so again, just emphasizing that unless progress is accelerated by all, the entire global community will fail to achieve SDG 5. This is actually a visual that just got released in the last 2 weeks. And so I'm not sure that you're able to see it clearly on your screen, but I do encourage you to go to our websites to have a close look and to see where your country is and what the data reveal about the status of women in that given country across the various targets and indicators of SDG 5. As Dean Smith said, a lot of this data and a lot of this analysis is coming out of our annual report, Progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Gender Snapshot. We do this report annually. We have some new visuals now that you saw in the previous slides that are going to be accompanying the report. So I do encourage you to have a look at it. It's available in multiple languages. The data, I don't know how often you all are using this global data for your papers, etc. But the data is also now available on our site. So have a look. I hope it's useful to you in your work and in your courses. I also wanted to point out before I conclude that we have a number of other reports where we take a deeper dive on some of these goals, right? So the annual report is meant to be a very short, kind of, easy to digest report that policymakers hopefully can easily skim and review. The more in-depth analysis on these various goals from a gender perspective comes from our Spotlight series. And so we have a number of these on Goal 8, on Goal 11, etc. So you can find those on our website as well. We also have a report that looks at and takes a deep dive at the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls. And so that report has been used actually quite a bit by policymakers who've been wanting to bring visibility in their kind of national discourse around the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls. And that report is from Insights to Action. So if you're interested in skimming through that, that's also available on data.unwomen.org. And so I'll leave you with that link there. And I think that's the end of my slideshow. So again, I hope this was useful to you. And over to you, Elizabeth, I believe, for the Q&A section.
Thank you so much. What great information. Your slides are, I was telling her earlier, slides are so beautiful. I hope that, some of the information we can dig into it a little bit further as we look at the report online. So happy to open the floor for questions at this point. If anybody would like to raise their hand with a question or place a question in the chat, I'm happy to share it on your behalf. So feel free.
Love also to hear from the students about what they're working on and what are their interests in gender data, if they wanted to share as well. I oftentimes get a lot of questions from students on where to go for the data. I actually got an email this morning from a student in the UK asking for some data and wanting to get advice on how to look at the SDGs from a gender perspective. I'm curious if any of you are doing anything like that in your coursework.
So Ginette, while the students are thinking of questions, I have a couple for you real quick, just to set the context. First off, they're in no particular order, but I'm struck by how much your data shows how the significant degree to which the pandemic set things back for women on this goal. Would we have achieved it, do you think, without the pandemic? Because my recollection of the data is it was better than it is now, but it still wasn't on track to achieve. But I'm just curious if my memory of the data is correct. Second question I had that's related is you mentioned a lot of missing data, and I know that's a big challenge. There was a lot of gray on those slides. I'm wondering the extent to which you all are challenged by the fact that a lot of the data is self-reported by members, and if that presents a problem. And then the last question I have, and this may be something beyond your scope, but how the progress on this goal is mixed at best. I'm trying to be diplomatic. Is that an outlier among the goals, or are we, when you're talking to colleagues maybe from other UN offices and departments, is this fairly typical for the SDGs more broadly?
Well, these are great questions. Thank you so much. Happy to jump right into it. And I see that there were some comments from the students, so I can turn to that in a minute. But in terms of the trajectory before COVID-19, you're absolutely right. We were not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030, even before the pandemic. Really, the story is one of kind of clawing back of progress, but in no way indicating that progress was actually at the rate or the pace that it needed to be. So globally, and this I'm talking about rich and poor countries, right? You look at target 5.4, on the division of unpaid care and domestic work, rich and poor countries alike are not where they need to be there. And that data is actually pre-pandemic. So many of the data that I started my slides with are kind of the most recent data that we have that in many cases are taking into account the pandemic. But the SDG 5 analysis, for the most part, is actually still relying on the pre-pandemic data. Oftentimes it takes about 2 years, 18 months for data to be updated. This is at the country level, right? This has nothing to do with the UN, but really the kind of cycle that governments go through in terms of collecting data. So actually, this is reflective of a story of inadequate progress even before the pandemic, right? Many of these issues are issues that predated the pandemic. The pandemic has only exacerbated inequalities, but in no way can we say that those inequalities did not exist beforehand. In terms of the self-reporting and the missing data, this is really quite an important point because in some cases, sometimes when you look at these issues for one particular country, you might have actually more data than we have at the global level, right? At the global level, the data has to be harmonized. It has to be comparable across countries, and countries need to report it in such a way that even if they collect it in a slightly different way or use a slightly different definition to what's been agreed at the international level, they need to kind of adjust it so that when we get it, right, at the global level, that it's comparable across countries. And oftentimes that's done by the custodian agency, right? So ILO will take the country data and make adjustments as needed to make sure that they're comparable, right? That the data we get from Russia, that the data we get from the US, for example, are comparable. But oftentimes these data gaps are really at the country level, and they're not self-reported in the sense that this is not kind of the US doing a qualitative assessment of where they are, right? This is actually coming from household surveys, from labor force statistics, from census data in some cases. And so it is data that's coming from the national statistical system. But again, really reflective of the data gaps that exist at the country level. So yes, in some cases, there's some kind of differences where we might have a little bit less at the global level because of that kind of cycle that I mentioned, but oftentimes really the data is missing at the country level. The way I've presented this in the past is talked about it in terms of a pyramid. Right? So, or in terms of an iceberg, if you will. If the data is not available at the country level, right, under that water, because we only see the very top, right? We only see the tip of the iceberg when we do these global aggregates and these regional aggregates. If it's not available at that bottom level, then we're not going to have it at the global level, right? So at the root of it has to be that this data is prioritized and collected within the national statistical system itself. Right. So if the US, for example, is not funding time use surveys, which are the surveys that we use to look at how much time women and men are spending on unpaid care and domestic work, if countries are not funding surveys to capture the prevalence of violence, domestic violence, et cetera, those are not going to be available at the global level. Right. So this really is at the core kind of an issue of investments and political prioritization of these data at the country level. In terms of whether SDG 5 is an outlier, unfortunately, no. I think, we're behind on all of the goals, right? The goals are aspirational, right? I mean, I think that like the MDGs, right, the idea is that we're all collectively working towards these goals with the understanding that we may not reach them all by 2030. But we definitely want to be, doing everything that we can to accelerate progress and to move in that direction. And so across the goals, I would say that we have a long road ahead. We've been focusing in kind of our classification on SDG 5, but as you saw from my presentation, we've also been monitoring very closely the other goals, Goal 1, Goal 2, Goal 8, et cetera. And what I hope comes out of my presentation is that not only is SDG 5 not going to be achieved by 2030, SDG 1, SDG 2, et cetera, will also not be achieved unless we focus on women and girls, right? You're not going to end poverty if women and girls are still in poverty, right? We're half the world's population, and so they need to be prioritized, and the kind of policies that are needed are going to be, potentially slightly different for really accelerating progress on the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in society, which oftentimes are women and girls living in extreme poverty, right? Living in some of those kind of poorest of the poor households. So, and oftentimes facing, as I said earlier, right, kind of compounding inequalities, right? They are facing other kind of inequalities that leave them behind in terms of the policy priorities that we see at the country level.
Thank you.
So I saw a few things on the chat. Let me turn to that very quickly. Oh, so there was a comment here about a research project on the election of women and political power. So of course, that's one of the areas that is highlighted under Goal 5 as well. We have two indicators there, looking at the share of women in parliament or in Congress, if you're looking at the US, but also the share of women in local government. I've been in the UN, I've been working at UN Women at UN Women at least for over 10 years, and within the UN system for longer than that. And when I first started, we wanted this data, and there was a demand for data on women in local government, and we didn't have it. We didn't have it at the global level is what I mean, right? So some countries may be collecting this, but we didn't have it at the global level. That's not true any longer. So with the SDGs, with the selection of this indicator to monitor the goal, countries have actually been working and really accelerated progress in making sure that this data is available for global monitoring. And so we now have that data for over 160 countries, I believe. So the share of women in parliament, we've had it for over, I think over 100 years, because IPU has been around for a very long time. And the data on women in local government was available last year and is available this year. So we're going to have now trend data to monitor progress. So I encourage you to look at that. We're also working on a project with UNDP. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Human Development Report Office. They have an index or a series of indices that look at gender equality and rank countries according to that. And one of the dimensions, so we've worked with them now to develop a new and improved set of gender indices that will be released hopefully next fall. And there, one of the domains that we have highlighted is exactly this, right? So women's kind of political power, women's decision-making power in society, and using that as a metric for assessing the status of women globally in ranking countries. And so when that comes out, I encourage you to look at that. Maybe it'll be helpful for your project. I don't know if we have any other comments, Elizabeth.
I think I see a couple of students. Oh, there we go. There's this question just came in. I knew a couple of students were typing in. So the question here from Savina is what students can do, right? What can we do now that we know this information? How can we act?
Yeah. No, I think we all have a role to play. And so this is a really great question. One of the other projects that maybe I could take a few moments to highlight is something that's called the Action Coalitions. It just got released last June. And the idea with that project, this new kind of UN Women project, is that it's only through global alliances that we're going to really see transformational change, and we're able to really kind of accelerate progress, right? It's working collectively, students, academics, the private sector, governments, civil society is working collectively on these kind of shared goals. And so we have over 2,000, I think close to 3,000 commitments so far. And so these are commitments that are provided at the individual level. They're provided by private organizations, by governments. And it's just basically kind of, telling the world, what you're doing as an individual or as part of an organization to do your part to bring about gender equality over the next 5 years. So that program is between now and 2026. And it's about, how do we work to bring about these changes and support each other in that process. The other thing I would say as a student is to learn about these issues, to engage at the local level, in your community at Seton Hall, but also outside of it, and really, bring others on board, right? Oftentimes, at least in my work, we're talking to kind of the converted. And what I tell my colleagues time and time again is, no, we need to reach out to others, because otherwise we're just going to be talking to ourselves and not really seeing kind of that multiplier effect that we really need to bring about change, right? So bring in that friend of yours that doesn't totally, believe in gender equality or believes that it's an issue, and show them these stats and these figures and encourage them to join us in this fight. So really do your part at all levels and in all of your interactions. I think that's really the what we can do, not only as students, but as individuals, right? Committed to these issues.
Thank you for saying that. That was going to be one of my questions about how do we get more people involved, right? I mean, you'll notice all of the people on this call, except for Dean Smith, are women. Most of the events that we have on gender equity, and we even have a new class on race and gender that is mostly women. But most of these events we see, mostly women coming in. So how does UN Women engage men in the conversation, and what can we do more to engage our allies?
Yeah. So we have this program that maybe you all are familiar with, the He for She campaign. Yeah, so that's one concrete way, right? And it's very much under that same principle, right? That it can't just be women, and it's not just a women's issue, that we need to bring men and boys on board. The other thing I would say is that we need to bring them on board early, right? We need to be engaging with them very early on, and making sure that these issues are raised and talked about from elementary school and beyond, right? So not kind of just starting that conversation when the students are in at the university level. So one of the things that you'll see is actually already embedded in the SDGs is an indicator that actually looks at this very concrete issue. Within government education policy, are they prioritizing kind of gender, training, sexuality education, et cetera? So that's actually an indicator that's being used to track progress on the education goal. And so what I would say is that, it's really, again, starting early, making sure that it's not just a conversation between women, but that we are, proactively engaging with our colleagues, our male colleagues and our, male friends and family members and inviting them to join the conversation and doing that in a proactive way. And not being afraid. I had another meeting. So we've been going from meeting to meeting because, of course, this is Women's Month, and there's a lot of events that happen. But there was a kind of an event that was organized by a university in Italy with a private sector, a very large private sector organization. And what was really interesting there is that they, these were women leaders talking about, their own kind of internal policies to promote gender equality in the workplace. And they said, we had programs in place, right, that had a kind of a 20-year, 10-year, maybe not 20, but, kind of a long trajectory for shifting things. And the pandemic has actually forced them to shift things earlier. They realized that it was having a very significant impact on working mothers. these are assets, right? So how do we make sure that we address these issues? How do we make sure that when we do have policies that are meant to promote men taking caring responsibilities and taking paternity leave, that they do so? And actually they revisit that. And the idea is to kind of accelerate some of those internal policies to promote more balance and equality, and not kind of, have a 5-year time frame, but maybe have an 18-month time frame, et cetera. And I thought that was really encouraging to hear. So I know I spent a lot of time kind of talking about all of the horrible things and all of the, the worrisome signs of where we are today. But there's also a lot of bright spots, and I think one of them is how kind of non-traditional actors are actually joining us in this fight for gender equality in a way that we haven't seen before. So, I think, and maybe, you would have seen this as well when you read the media, the newspapers, et cetera. I've never, heard so much or seen so much, discussion about, the need to address kind of, the childcare problem in this country and elsewhere in the way that I see now, right? So it's much more front and center than it has been ever before. And so there are some hopeful signs if you look for them.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. There's a question in the chat about your career and how students can set themselves up for success in a field like yours. Yeah. If you're interested in, and I think here I'm going to take the question from the perspective of if you're interested in a field of gender data, kind of statistics and research. And so I would really encourage you to not shy away from kind of those math courses, those statistics courses. Data, I don't care in what field you're entering now, is going to be increasingly important, right? So, this is really an asset, and those with information have the power. And so I would really encourage you to take some of those courses now to maybe develop some of those skill sets if you're interested in pursuing kind of, a master's degree, et cetera, to make sure you're looking for those that are kind of quantitative heavy, just because I think that is an asset, that is a hard asset that you can use not only in this field, but in other fields as well. And of course, an increasing area. I would also recommend, and I don't know if maybe Elizabeth, you can tell me, and but one of the other things that I think is really increasingly important is how to tell stories with data and with different types of data, not just quantitative data, but kind of really visualizing and using kind of graphics, et cetera, to tell a compelling story. And so if you have the opportunity to take courses on data visualization, I do encourage you to do that as well. But yeah, that would be my suggestion, is to do that. I guess the other thing that I think was really valuable for me is that when I graduated from Seton Hall, my first job was at a think tank in New York, working on domestic policy. So it wasn't international policy. In fact, it was actually looking at social policy within the US. But what was so amazing about that was that they had a model where they really emphasized kind of interdisciplinary work, right? So you had an economist working with a child psychologist, working with an education expert on social policy issues, right? And so I would say that if you're interested in kind of, this field, is to make sure that you're kind of a generalist in a way, right? That you're learning about different kind of disciplines and a little bit of everything, and maybe specializing in one particular area, but also keeping tabs of the work that others are doing in other disciplines to inform and to improve your own work. Yeah, that's really good advice. One of the programs that I'm involved with at Seton Hall, the Leadership Development Program, is a university-wide program. And so one of the benefits of that program is that they get to work with leaders from other fields. And I always say, what an important, helpful skill that will be for you going out into the world of international affairs, where you're going to be working with, leaders in education and leaders in healthcare and leaders in business and things like that. So absolutely. All right, well, I think we have answered all the questions in the chat, and we are coming to the end of the hour. So I want to thank you so much, Ginette, for being with us today, for all this rich information that we can use to help us in our fight for gender equity. And we look forward to reading the report a little bit more thoroughly and sharing in what you do. Please keep us in mind when there's something we can do to help UN Women with the outreach.
Will do. Well, thank you so much for that offer, Elizabeth. I definitely will. And thanks again. Thank you both, and to the students as well. I had a lovely time chatting with you all, and thank you for the great questions.
Thank you, Ginette.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.